Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and this shelf with all these bins on it. This is where I do my vermicomposting. Vermicomposting? It's basically composting but with the help of worms. And here on my shelving system, it's the bins that you see up here to the top left that are my oldest. And then you kind of go through this kind of swervy pattern to get to the younger systems. I wanted to talk about my older systems here. I've got this system over here, the oldest of them all. It's undergoing a process that I refer to as horizontal migration, because if you lift off the covers, you can see that only part of the bin has plastic coverings. All these flimsy paper coverings don't do much in terms of holding the moisture in. It's only under the plastic that you've got a nice amount of moisture, and it's under there that you've also got some food intended to lure the worms out of the finished compost. Now, here in this system, this system is set up a little differently. It looks consistent across the top. It's because this is not quite at that stage yet. It's not migrating, and here the worms are doing what I refer to as foraging. So I've not fed this system in 29 days. The worms have been expected to just kind of work their way through that material and pick off any remaining scraps, so that in the end we've got some really nice fine compost. And a week ago when we last checked in on here, when it was still only 22 days into the foraging process, most of the feedback I got from the viewers was that it's ready. So I would think that now, a week later, it's even more ready. So my aim was to get this so-called foraging bin configured much the way you saw over there in the bin that's already migrating. So we can get this bin over here also migrating, get the worms rounded up so we can get them started into a new environment. So I'm going to get this system up onto the bench so we can get to work. Let's get started. So when I do one of these, I like to create these little partition walls so that when I shove over the finished castings and make room for the feeding area, it's possible to easily keep them apart and at the same time provide plenty of room for the worms to pass through. It's kind of a visual aid for me. I like to do it this way. So I'm going to go get that bin over onto the bench and get these babies installed. Do you suppose this delicious pumpkin might be enough to entice the worms to move out of their castings? Combined with some of this coffee? I hope it is, because that's what they're getting. That pumpkin, it's frozen, and when it lets out, every now and then, I bump into one of these little caterpillars in my system here. Because this system used to reside outside, and while it did, I think some other creatures occupied our worm bin here. Some of the occupants were left to stay, like pill bugs and stuff. I've allowed pill bugs that I found in here to remain, but anytime I bump into, here's another one of these little caterpillars, I evict them with extreme prejudice, if that makes sense, if you get my gist. So I'm just glancing around here to see if there's any other ones that I can notice. You can see the pill bugs, they're all kind of nestled over here in this corner. Looks like they found themselves their own little private part of the bin to hang out. You can even see a couple of them resting a little bit lower down here in this hole. And this little guy sort of burrowed a hole for himself too. Not very reactive. What are these guys, sleeping? Are they alive? I don't know. This little guy just rolled up into a ball, but all right, let's proceed. Those little guys can stay. They actually help work down tougher materials like little sticks and stems and stuff. They're experts at that, while the worms are better at slurping up stuff that's already sort of kind of broken down a little bit in advance, thanks to the microscopic life in the system. Gotta say, that plastic covering, doing a great job keeping the moisture in. This stuff is so nice and damp, but there's really no sign of it other than the dark color. When you look at me handling it, you can see it all flakes apart. So despite being very, very damp, it's not sticky or gooey or anything like that, which is ideal in the worm bin. So in the past, I'd always use the progress of these little sticks and stems as sort of my measure for starting into the migration of the worms. So like in the past, I might have not wanted to get the migration started quite yet based on the fact that there's still sticks and stems, but I think I'm going to just kind of see if I can modify my ways a little bit, because I think we'll get just as good results if we don't wait. Man, look at all these worms in here. This thing's not been fed in more than 4 weeks, so even though I'm kind of bumping into little scraps of leftover stuff, whatever it might be, I could tell just from handling it, it's something tougher. A lot of times I chop up avocado seeds, and this is what I believe to be a chunk of, yeah, avocado seed. Once you crack it open, you can tell what it is. I'm thinking that since we're setting up a migration zone, the intent is to round up the worms, lure them over into one part of the bin. It's probably a good idea to snag any sort of junk that I encounter within the material as I go through it, checking it out, aerating the material, loosening it up in preparation for this, because I do need to make space on the edge of the bin. But I believe, you know what, I'm gonna set up the feeding area over on this side, because we've now loosened up this edge of the bin and we can leave this as is, and we'll stack it up a bit higher here so that by the time we get to the other edge, we've created enough room to build this feeding area up. Oh, I almost forgot about the cork. Cork is one of our weird little experimental objects that has been in service in my worm systems for years now. Years go by and that thing hardly changes. Although I did sort of sense that it was getting maybe a little bit more brittle. Usually a cork is pretty tough. You can't just chip off a chunk of it with your finger. But I think at one point I was able to already chip away fragments of that cork, suggesting to me that it is kind of breaking down, maybe not by worms eating it, maybe more by being infiltrated by fungi or whatever type of microorganisms make their way into wood. 'Cause that's all cork really is. It's a type of wood, but it's you know, got that spongy kind of soft consistency, but it's also extremely tough stuff. I know they make floors out of this stuff and other things. Just an interesting material. Man, this bin is just so cool, you know. The only thing that I don't like about it is the fact that I'm seeing so many of these sticks and stems. So, you know, if I could have a wish come true for this system, it would be that all of these little bits and pieces that litter the material, I wish they'd be gone already. But, you know, I'm changing my thinking on what the finished product is after I complete a migration of worms out of their finished compost, after a round of foraging is considered to be complete. And that's really the measure, is, you know, how complete is this foraging? It's obviously incomplete. And at this point, I think it's almost by design. It's deliberate, because I do want the material to have lingering bits of carbon-based food items, more nitrogen-rich food items. I like the fact that this material already has a little supply of sustenance in it already. It's not been completely depleted of food and bedding. Because what happens once the worms get moved out is that I'll hang on to this material and kind of nurture it based on the assumption that there's probably a whole boatload of cocoons floating around within this material that are, you know, given the proper conditions, the right temperature, right dampness and whatnot, those cocoons are going to, you know, erupt into a whole bunch of new baby worms. So that's kind of the game plan for this one. It's what I've been doing in all my systems, as a matter of fact, most recently. And it's sometimes a little bit of a lackluster kind of outcome, you know, because somehow you imagine this massive outbreak of all these baby worms emerging from all their cocoons, and, you know, to a certain degree you get a good amount of worms showing up, coming out of the cocoons. It's usually not such an impressive thing, at least in my history. It's not been such an impressive outcome, but who knows, that could change. It would be kind of cool to see, for example, this system get evacuated and then a couple months later suddenly find that it's full of these little tiny baby worms that are gradually growing in size, and then it'll let another month or two after that go by, and then all of a sudden you've got like a whole new batch of worms there, all recently born, hatched, whatever, right there in your compost. And then at that point you could really kind of get that warm fuzzy feeling that this is compost that you could really throw out into the garden, let the plants use it, but you're not at the same time also releasing a bunch of baby worms out into your garden when you could just as easily have kept them in your worm farm. So in a nutshell, I guess that's my point of view on running one of these systems this way, managing it this way. I didn't always do it this way, you know. In the past I used to, one way or another, get the worms out of the material, migrate them out, either over time the way we're doing here, or do it in a much more abrupt fashion by kind of utilizing light to drive the worms down into their material, drive them down, and just at the same time continue skimming off that top layer that they've left by diving down. In the end, removing all the castings and everything else, leaving the pile of worms at the bottom of the stack. A little bit labor intensive, but it gets the worms separated from their compost pretty much in a jiffy, as opposed to what we're embarking on here, which is a migration of the worms, letting them do all the work basically. Other than what we're doing here, which is just setting the stage for what we want to see happen. I'm just trying to be really careful here because, man, this bin is pretty loaded, and I feel like I'm having trouble opening up a large enough space here into which we can position our feeding zone. I'm even kind of looking across the table over here at the height of these things, because the idea here was that these would rest within the bin side by side, and that gets us up to about here. I'm not sure, after we backfill this material, it'll utilize a little bit of what's here on top to fill this gap, but it's not going to drop the level that much. I might have to sort of restore this into a little bit of a diagonal arrangement so that there's a good, I just like to, you know, get the level right up to the very top. So even if a worm, for whatever reason, comes up on the surface, wants to jump over into the feeding area where I'm going to do the collection of the worms, then try to set it up so that's easy enough for them to do as well. Okay, things are looking good here. Oh, if you look really closely, we've already got a worm who's voluntarily made its way over into our collection area, even without any food being placed in there for them. Good job, guy. I appreciate that. All right, let's get this thing set up. This is going to be where we start. I'm going to try to maximize the size of this thing. So, roughly speaking, yeah. Okay, not bad. Yeah, let's get this thing in here. Just wide enough to go from edge to edge, and it should be tall enough once we backfill to have a pretty nice adjoining top of the material to the top of the partition wall. Now, I've got my collection of pre-made bedding over here, which is going to come in pretty handy. It's interesting too. I guess this little chunk of watermelon was used. It's a little spoiler alert. I am working on a new time lapse, and the time lapse worms received a little bit of watermelon yesterday. I had this tiny chunk left over, didn't really fit in with what I was trying to do in the scene, so I chucked it in here thinking next time I need some of my pre-made bedding here, some little worms are going to get a nice treat. So I guess in addition to pumpkin, that little piece of watermelon rind should also be a welcomed little addition. So I guess I'm going to start stacking in different stuff over here. Get these little, I hate to think that a worm, the dampness of the worm, or I guess it's the dampness of this food, or the dampness, actually the opposite, right? The dampness of the paper is what's attaching itself to what's frozen. So it would be kind of weird if a poor little worm were to make contact with something frozen and get stuck the same way. So I don't know if they've got the ability to kind of emit some slime or whatever, somehow free themselves. Maybe there's just enough body heat to... No, I guess not. Yeah, I don't know. Kind of like we've all seen in the films, right? We've seen that old trick. Sticking your tongue to the lamp post and getting stuck there. A triple dog dare you to do it. All right, let's get some of these in here. I guess this is 5 pieces, leaving 5 more pieces to stack in into another layer. So same way we saved half the pumpkin bits, let's save half the coffee so we can build out this this feeding area. Stuff I'm sprinkling in here is a little bit of grit. The grit that I use here is pulverized eggshell. So another little ingredient I like to use in my feeding zones are these toilet paper tubes. They always seem to be just about the right size to almost act as a spacer, but more importantly, I can leave those little gaps without having to put all that material in there. So these little pockets of air allow me to come up with a pretty good sized feeding zone in the end without needing to utilize so much material. And at some point soon the whole thing will collapse. But it's just sort of I don't know, just sort of a way to come up with a good tall feeding area without loading it over, you know, with too much material, with these little air pockets built in down below. Alright, so we built another little foundation for the next layer of food, and it's pretty much the same as the previous layer. Coffee, pumpkin bits. You can even give them a little bit more grit sprinkled over the top, and you know what? Why don't we even give them another little boost of bedding over here? And carbon food source is just the coffee filter itself. I would imagine that all the juices emitted from these frozen chunks of pumpkin as they thaw are going to soak into that piece of paper, and even after they've eaten these bits of pumpkin, I bet you that piece of coffee filter is going to remain a nice tempting thing for them to continue nibbling on with all those yummy pumpkin juices. So what do we got left? Not much. Just put a little bit more bedding across the top, I guess. And then we're pretty much at the height of these little partitions that I threw in here. And then we could backfill. So here too, just kind of laying it all in loosely. This stuff is damp. It sits in my little tub here with a certain amount of moisture. And once these frozen chunks of veggie start to thaw, they're going to kick out a bunch of moisture too. Should make the feeding zone into a really tempting spot to be. These are just those little scraps of like a banana stem. There was the cork. Keep forgetting about the cork. We'll throw that in there as well. And these little chunks of seed. Any other junk that we collected while we were plowing through, little chunks of bedding. I think the rest can just get leveled off at this point. But let's finish covering up this feeding area. Get it all kind of level. Next time we check in here, those cardboard tubes will have collapsed. The level of this thing will have dropped. Everything will have sort of settled. But in the beginning, it seems like if we can somehow match up the levels, then maybe there's still that little opportunity for these worms to make their way over just by walking across the top of the surface. Okay, we're getting there. So here I can kind of put the whole feeding area under compression for a moment. Trying to pick out these little scraps of cardboard that snuck into the nice, beautiful finished compost. So we'll just get everything sort of leveled off here. Didn't really use much of this massive mound that we accumulated out here, did we? I just want to sort of try to level it off, but man, I am really full in here. That's another definite consideration you might want to take when you're thinking to yourself, you know, Do I go or do I stop? Do I continue composting? Do I continue adding more material to the bin? Watching its level rise. At some point in the future you want to do something like this, you're going to need the space to shove all this stuff into a tighter space. So it seems like if I'd gone any longer and, you know, kept composting in this thing for another month or two and built up this batch of finished compost to be much more than it is here, we would have eventually gotten to the point where, you know, I'd have to either settle for a much smaller feeding area or something, you know, something else would have to happen here. But I think this is just right. We've made maximum use of the space we've got in here, and we're almost done. All that remains is to restore the coverings, and here we'll bring back the plastic. We're not going to use all of it. What we'll do is we'll fold it back, we'll cover up the feeding area where we want to have all that damp cardboard and the moisture that gets emitted by the thawing pumpkin bits. We want all that moisture to remain right there, making that into like a haven for the worms to want to make their way over into and remain in once they get over there, while at the same time allowing for the finished compost section of the bin out here to just dry a little bit more. I'm not going to leave it exposed to the air this way. That cardboard covering that you saw on top earlier is going to come back, but I'm also going to insert one additional layer of paper in here, just some little bit of newspaper, just so that the finished castings do have something other than the top covering of cardboard on top of it. And even though it's coverings that are, you know, seemingly pretty thick, paper's not very thick, but the cardboard is, but regardless, it does allow for moisture to pass through it to a certain point, and it will allow the castings to dry. So it's kind of a 1-2 punch to get the worms to do our bidding, which is lure them, but at the same time repel them. And I guess we'll have to see how long it takes. Hopefully it happens quickly. I guess the next thing I need to do quickly is start preparing a home for these guys, so I've got some place to move them once they're ready for that. All right, everyone, that's pretty much it. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching.